Case number 1. Michael Peterson. In 2009, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation began an audit. The subject was one of its own agents, Duane Deaver, a blood spatter analyst who had testified in dozens of criminal cases across the state. What investigators found in those files defied easy explanation. Deaver had constructed his forensic experiments in a garage. He had fastened a sponge to a styrofoam head, struck it with a stick, and photographed the results. He had presented those photographs, those garage photographs, as the scientific basis for his expert conclusions in a court of law. The audit found he had committed perjury, not in one case, in dozens. The question that followed was the same question that follows all such revelations. Who was already in prison because of it? To understand how Duane Deaver's garage became the center of a state investigation, you have to begin 2 years earlier, with the man his testimony convicted. Michael Ivor Peterson was 58 years old in December 2001. A graduate of Duke University with a degree in political science, a decorated Marine Corps veteran of Vietnam, and a published novelist, Peterson occupied a specific position in Durham, North Carolina, the kind of prominent, social, intellectually recognizable figure whose name appears in newspaper columns before it appears in court documents. He had 5 children, 2 biological sons, and 2 daughters adopted from the family of a close friend killed in the war. He lived in a large mansion on Cedar Street. Behind the affluence, court documents would later establish there was financial pressure, debt, a life insurance policy on his wife, and a marriage that prosecutors would argue was concealing significant strain. Kathleen Hunt Peterson was 48 years old. She was a senior executive at Nortel Networks, a career built through ability and drive, and she was known in Durham for both her professional accomplishments and her philanthropic work. She had 1 biological daughter, Caitlin, and had been a stepmother to Michael's children through their years together. On the evening of December 9th, 2001, the couple spent time by their pool. Nothing about that evening, by any account, announced what was coming. December 9th, 2001. Michael Peterson stated that he remained outside after Kathleen went in. At approximately 2:40 a.m., he found her at the bottom of the back staircase. She was dead. He called 911 twice. When first responders arrived, they noted that the blood in the stairwell had partially dried, a timeline inconsistency that investigators could not reconcile with Michael's account of a recent discovery. The quantity of blood was substantial. Kathleen had sustained 7 lacerations to her scalp. The state would argue she had been beaten with a blowpoke, a fireplace tool the prosecution characterized as missing. The defense argued she had fallen, a woman who had consumed Valium and alcohol that evening, down a steep and poorly lit staircase. The blowpoke, it would later emerge, was found in the house. That fact was not prominent at trial. Durham detectives arrived at a scene that raised more questions than Michael Peterson's account resolved. Detective Art Holland led the investigation. The physical evidence, the blood, the stairwell, the dried patterns, sent forensic analysts to work. Separately, investigators surfaced a connection that would have been difficult to ignore. In 1985, while Peterson was stationed in Germany, a family friend named Elizabeth Ratliff had died at the bottom of a staircase. Peterson had been present. Her body was later exhumed, and a forensic pathologist reclassified her death as a homicide. 11 days after Kathleen's death, on December 20th, 2001, Michael Peterson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. District Attorney Jim Hardin prosecuted. Defense Attorney David Rudolph entered a not guilty plea. Trial began on July 1st, 2003, in Durham County Courthouse, before Judge Orlando Hudson. It ran for 5 months. The jury heard from a long list of witnesses, but the prosecution's case rested most heavily on a single analyst, SBI Agent Duane Deaver. Deaver's testimony was specific and detailed. He told the jury that blood spatter patterns in the stairwell and blood found inside the waistband of Peterson's shorts proved that Kathleen had been beaten to death, not that she had fallen. The placement of the blood, he argued, was inconsistent with a fall and consistent with repeated blunt force strikes. The Elizabeth Ratliff connection was also presented. Peterson did not testify. On October 10, 2003, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. Judge Hudson sentenced Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin Atwater, delivered a victim impact statement. The conviction stood for years. Then the audit reached Deaver's files, the styrofoam head, the sponge, the garage. The audit's findings were unambiguous. Deaver had fabricated methodology and committed perjury across multiple cases. In 2011, Peterson's conviction was overturned. He was released on house arrest pending retrial. In February 2017, he entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter, a legal mechanism that acknowledges the state possessed sufficient evidence for a conviction while allowing the defendant to maintain his innocence. He was sentenced to time served. The NCSBI audit that Deaver's exposure triggered did not end with Peterson's release. It extended across dozens of cases, prompting a review of every conviction his testimony had touched. What it could not do was answer the question the staircase had always raised. Whether Kathleen Peterson fell or was killed, a jury never heard the full truth about the science. Michael Peterson is 82 years old. He is free. Kathleen Hunt Peterson died on the morning of December 9th, 2001. And that is the one fact in this case that no audit will ever change. Case number 2. Joe Bryan. 1 week, 1 introductory course. No prior experience as a forensic expert in any court. When the Texas Forensic Science Commission examined the credentials of Robert Thorman, the officer who had testified as a blood spatter analyst in the murder conviction of Joe Bryan. Those were the findings. Not a decade of laboratory work, not a graduate degree in forensic science, not a single prior appearance on the witness stand in any capacity. 1 week in 1985 at an introductory seminar on blood spatter interpretation. That was the scientific foundation on which a man was convicted of murdering his wife and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Joe Bryan served 34 of them before he was paroled, not exonerated, paroled, at the age of 79. Clifton, Texas is a small town in Bosque County where a high school principal is not merely an administrator, but a civic institution. Joe C. Bryan, 45 years old in the fall of 1985, held a master's degree and had built his career there across years of consistent, visible public service. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a figure of genuine respect, an educator trusted with the school at the center of town life, the kind of man parents pointed to when they wanted to describe good leadership. He was married to Mickey Bryan. Together, they were embedded in Clifton in the way that only decades of shared investment can embed people. Whatever the prosecution would later construct around Joe Bryan's name and reputation, it had to be built against that foundation. Mickey Bryan was 44 years old. She was a 4th grade teacher, and she worked in the same community where her husband was principal. Their professional lives and their personal lives were woven into Clifton in equal measure. 2 educators who had spent their careers serving the same town. On the morning of October 15th, 1985, Mickey Bryan did not arrive at school. Colleagues went to her home to check on her. They found her in her bed, shot multiple times. She was dead. Joe Bryan was 120 miles away in Austin at a principal's convention, where his attendance was documented and his presence confirmed by multiple witnesses who had spent time with him throughout the previous evening. The prosecution's theory required the jury to accept a specific sequence of events. Joe Bryan left the Austin convention during the night, drove 120 miles to Clifton in the rain, entered the house without leaving a trace, shot his wife multiple times, and drove the 120 miles back to Austin before morning. A round trip of 240 miles, a murder, and a return to a hotel room, all without a single witness and without any physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. The motive prosecutors argued was a life insurance payout. No documentation of significant financial pressure, no established evidence of the policy terms, and no proof that Bryan stood to materially benefit in a way that supplied a credible motive was established as fact at trial. It remained the prosecution's assertion. Investigators found nothing at the crime scene that linked Joe Bryan to the shooting. What they found was a flashlight located in the trunk of his car several days after Mickey's death. The flashlight was sent to Robert Thorman, a local law enforcement officer, for forensic examination. Thorman had attended 1 week-long introductory course on blood spatter analysis. He had never testified as a blood spatter expert before. He had conducted no such analysis in any prior criminal matter. Examining microscopic specks on the flashlight's surface under magnification, Thorman concluded that they were high-velocity impact back spatter from a close-range gunshot, meaning, he testified, that Joe Bryan had held the flashlight while his wife was shot. Bryan was arrested in October 1985 and charged with murder. The case went to trial in 1986, with jury selection beginning in Bosque County. The proceedings attracted local attention, a well-known principal, a beloved teacher, a marriage that looked from the outside like the kind of Clifton had always produced. The first proceedings, with proceedings that ended without a final, definitive verdict. A retrial was held in 1989 at the Bosque County Courthouse. At that retrial, the flashlight and Thorman's analysis remained the prosecution's core physical evidence. The defense had one overriding argument. Joe Bryan was 120 miles away. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. The convention records confirmed it. No physical evidence placed him in Clifton that night. The jury was not moved. Thorman testified the specks were characterized as blood spatter, and Joe Bryan was convicted of murder. The sentence was 99 years. Joe Bryan entered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice at 49 years old. The years accumulated. In time, the Texas Forensic Science Commission was asked to examine Thorman's work. The commission's finding was unambiguous. His methods were scientifically invalid. He had no credible expertise in the field in which he had testified. The science he had brought to that jury was, in the commission's assessment, fiction. Thorman later acknowledged that his entire preparation had consisted of the single introductory course taken years before Bryan's case. He had never worked as a blood spatter analyst before or since. The commission declared the science invalid. The state paroled Joe Bryan in March 2020. He was 79 years old. What the state did not do was formally exonerate him. The distance between a commission ruling that the evidence was scientifically worthless and the absence of a legal exoneration is where Bryan's case currently rests. He is 83 years old. He is free. He has not been exonerated. Case number 3, Warren Horinek. At the 1996 trial of Warren Horinek in Tarrant County, Texas, the prosecution called its witnesses. So did the defense. Among the witnesses who testified that Warren Horinek had not killed his wife, that the physical evidence at the scene was consistent with suicide, that the investigators who examined it reached that conclusion, were the homicide detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, and the elected district attorney of Tarrant County, who had reviewed every available piece of evidence and explicitly refused to bring charges, stating his belief that the evidence showed a suicide. The people whose professional obligation was to build a case against Warren Horinek stood in court and said, under oath, that they believed he was innocent. The jury convicted him regardless. 30 years later, the question that conviction raises has never been answered to the satisfaction of the record. What evidence was powerful enough to override all of them? Warren Horonek was 38 years old in the spring of 1995. He had served as an officer with the Fort Worth Police Department and had also trained and practiced as a paramedic. Credentials rooted entirely in public safety, the kind of professional identity defined by being the person who shows up when others cannot manage the situation. He was married to Bonnie Horonek. He was also, by his own acknowledgement and by the contemporaneous record, struggling with severe alcoholism. Both facts belong in this account. The alcoholism does not explain a murder. The official investigators concluded was a suicide, and the law enforcement credentials do not eliminate the personal difficulties. Both are true. Neither resolves the other. Bonnie Horonek was 38 years old. She was a high-powered attorney, professionally accomplished in a way that existed entirely apart from the strain of her marriage. The couple's relationship was under real and documented pressure, and the argument that preceded her death on March 14th, 1995, was part of that pattern. Bonnie's parents were aware of how difficult things had become between them. They would become central figures in what followed. The people who refused to accept the official conclusion and set in motion the legal machinery that would send their son-in-law to prison over the documented objections of the investigators who worked the case. March 14th, 1995, Fort Worth, Texas. After the argument, Warren Horonek stated that Bonnie went into the bedroom alone. He heard a shot. He went in and found her. He called 911. And then, as a trained paramedic who understood exactly what to do when someone's life could still be saved, he performed CPR on his wife. That professional training, the same credential that defined his work identity, became the prosecution's central forensic battleground. The medical examiner who examined the scene and the body concluded that the death was a suicide. The homicide detectives reached the same conclusion. The district attorney reviewed the complete investigative file and declined to prosecute. What changed the trajectory of this case was not new evidence. Bonnie's parents retained Tom Bevel, a private blood spatter analyst, and successfully lobbied a judge to appoint a special prosecutor, a mechanism that moved the case forward over the elected DA's documented objection. Bevel and colleague Anita Zanin examined Warren's shirt, the shirt he wore while performing CPR, and identified tiny blood dots on the fabric. Their conclusion: the dots were not CPR exhalation blood. They were high-velocity gunshot impact spatter, indicating Warren had been holding the gun when it fired. Warren Horonek entered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice at age 38. The sentence was 30 years. For the men who had investigated the case, the detectives, the medical examiner, the district attorney, the conviction represented an outcome they had worked in their official capacities to prevent. The DA had declined to prosecute. The homicide investigators had concluded suicide. The medical examiner had signed the same finding. None of that professional consensus, assembled through the standard instruments of a homicide investigation, was sufficient to prevent a private hire and a cooperative judge from taking the case in a different direction. In the years that followed, blood spatter science as a forensic discipline developed more rigorous standards and more honest acknowledgments of its limitations. The trial at Tarrant County in 1996 featured two blood spatter experts for the prosecution, and, for the defense, the homicide investigators and the elected DA, all testifying that the scene was consistent with suicide. What no one in that courtroom could have testified to was the forensic consensus that would emerge in the years following, that it is scientifically impossible to reliably distinguish high-velocity gunshot spatter from CPR exhalation blood on fabric. The two patterns are indistinguishable. The testimony that sent Warren Horinek to prison for 30 years described a forensic distinction that the discipline itself no longer accepts as valid. Warren Horinek has served more than 28 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. No court has overturned his conviction. No commission has ordered a formal review. The forensic discipline that produced the testimony used to convict him has since invalidated the methodology it rested on, specifically the claim that CPR exhalation blood can be reliably distinguished from gunshot impact spatter on clothing. That distinction cannot be made. In the years since this trial, no credentialed forensic analyst has published peer-reviewed work supporting it. Warren Horinek is 66 years old. He is incarcerated. The doors that have opened for others in this series have not opened for him. Case number 4. Jane Dorotik. During the appeals process in Jane Dorotik's case, attorneys from the Loyola Project for the Innocent asked the California Department of Justice criminalists a direct question. Where were the photographs of the blood spatter they had described in their trial testimony? Where were the laboratory notes, the formal documentation, the written records of what they had observed in the Dorotik bedroom? The criminalists answered, there were no photographs. There were no laboratory notes. There were no formal records of any kind. They had visited the scene. They had formed their conclusions about the bloodstain patterns, and they had testified about those conclusions from memory. The evidence that sent Jane Dorotik to prison for 20 years existed in its entirety, in the recollections of analysts who had never written down what they claimed to have seen. In California, in 2001, that was sufficient to convict a woman of first-degree murder and sentence her to 25 years to life. Jane Dorotik was 53 years old in February 2000. She was a healthcare executive in San Diego County, professionally established across years of work in a demanding field requiring both technical knowledge and administrative responsibility. She and her husband Robert were heading toward the end of their marriage. Divorce proceedings were underway, and the prosecution would argue that the prospect of alimony payments had supplied her motive. That was the prosecution's theory, not an established fact drawn from documented financial evidence, but an inference about what a person navigating a divorce might want to avoid. It would anchor a case that rested on no physical evidence directly connecting Jane Dorotik to any act of violence. Robert Dorotik was 55 years old. He was an engineer. The couple's marriage was failing, and the legal process of ending it had begun. The routines of their shared life continued alongside those proceedings. On the morning of February 13th, 2000, Robert went for a run near their home in Valley Center, in San Diego County. He was a regular runner. The morning jog was part of his routine. He did not return. Jane reported him missing when he failed to come home. His body was found later on a dirt road in the area, beaten and strangled. He was a man whose last ordinary act was lacing up his shoes and going for a run. February 13th, 2000, Valley Center, California. When investigators turned their attention to the couple's home, following the discovery of Robert's body, they found bloodstains in the master bedroom. The prosecution's theory, built from those stains, was specific and consequential. Robert had been killed in his sleep, struck repeatedly while lying in bed, and his body had then been moved and left on the dirt road where it was found. California Department of Justice criminalists examined the bedroom stains. Their conclusion, the patterns were consistent with impact spatter from a bludgeoning at the location of the bed. Jane Dorotik, who stood to pay alimony in the pending divorce, who had reported her husband missing, who was the spouse, became the focus of the investigation. The case against Jane, built through circumstantial reasoning, motive, opportunity, and physical evidence that the state's analysts said placed the crime in the bedroom. At trial in San Diego County in 2001, the state's blood spatter analyst testified with professional confidence about the patterns he had observed. He described specific aspects of the staining, explained their forensic significance, and placed them at the center of the prosecution's theory. He did not disclose, because he was not asked and did not offer, that he had never photographed those stains, that no written documentation of his observations had ever been created, that the physical evidence he was describing to the jury had no formal record to support it. The jury heard expert testimony about specific physical evidence described with professional authority. They heard the financial motive. They did not hear about the absence of documentation. In 2001, Jane Dorotik was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. The documentation failure in the Dorotik case was not an isolated lapse. It reflected a broader problem in forensic practice that multiple wrongful conviction reviews have since identified. Analysts who form conclusions at a scene and then testify to those conclusions from memory years later, with no contemporaneous record to constrain or verify their account. The conclusions become fixed in the analyst's recollection, while the physical evidence itself, the stains, their dimensions, their precise distribution, exists only in notes that were never taken. What the jury in 2001 received was not documented physical evidence. It was expert memory, presented with the authority of documentation it never possessed. The Loyola Project for the Innocent investigated the case. DNA testing of the bedroom stains excluded Jane Dorotik entirely. The blood was not connected to her, to any weapon associated with her, or to any action she had taken. Then came the admission during appellate proceedings. The criminalists acknowledged they had never photographed or formally documented the stains. Their trial testimony about specific blood spatter patterns had come from memory. No photograph, no laboratory record, no documentation of any kind. Memory was the evidence. Memory had sent Jane Dorotik to prison for 2 decades. In May 2022, the charges against Jane Dorotik were fully dismissed. She was exonerated after approximately 20 years of incarceration. Jane Dorotik is 79 years old. She is free. In California, forensic practice following the Dorotik case and others like it, documentation standards for crime scene analysis have been subject to increased scrutiny. Whether the specific failure here, testimony built entirely from analyst memory, with no photograph, no note, no contemporaneous record, could occur in a modern California courtroom under current protocols, is a question the legal community has debated. The question that the Loyola Project answered in 2022 is narrower and more definitive. It could not stand once the full record was examined. Case number 5, Paul House. In 2006, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in House versus Bell. The case had reached the nation's highest court after more than 20 years of litigation, and the court's conclusion was precise. No reasonable juror, having heard all of the available evidence, would have found Paul House guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The court identified 2 specific findings that had not been before the original jury. The semen recovered from the victim's clothing during the original investigation had been subjected to DNA analysis. It belonged to her husband, not to Paul House. And the blood found on Paul House's jeans, the blood an FBI serologist had testified was spatter from a violent physical struggle, had originated from Carolyn Munsey's autopsy blood collection vials, which had cracked and leaked inside the evidence transport container during handling. The blood on his jeans had never been on a living person during a murder. It had pooled out of a broken test tube onto a pair of denim jeans inside a cardboard evidence box. Paul Gregory House was 26 years old in the summer of 1985. He lived in Union County, Tennessee. He had a prior criminal record, a sex offense that had resulted in parole, and that record would function throughout the investigation and trial as a lens through which everything else about him was interpreted. The prior offense is stated here because the record requires it, and because its role in shaping the case against House cannot be understood without acknowledging it honestly. It made him vulnerable the moment investigators focused on him, and it shaped the jury's perception before a word of forensic testimony had been offered. Prior offenses are not evidence of subsequent crimes. In this case, they functioned as though they were. Carolyn Muncie was 29 years old. She was married and the mother of 2 children. She and Paul House were neighbors in the rural community of Luttrell, Tennessee. On July 13, 1985, she was found beaten to death on a wooded ridge near her home. Her husband reported her missing. The community search found her on that ridge. She was a young mother, known in her community, gone in the way that leaves neighbors uncertain and children without answers. Her death was real and deserved a thorough and honest investigation. What it received was an investigation shaped by a prior record and physical evidence that could not survive scrutiny. July 13, 1985. Luttrell, Tennessee. Paul House had been in the area that night. When investigators examined his clothing the following day, they found what appeared to be blood on his jeans. Carolyn Muncie's body had shown evidence of sexual violence, and semen had been recovered from her clothing. House had a prior sex offense. The investigation moved quickly toward him. The blood on his jeans and the semen from the victim's clothing were both sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington for analysis. The FBI serologist who analyzed the evidence testified at the 1986 trial that the blood on House's jeans was consistent with having come from Carolyn Muncie during a violent physical struggle. The semen recovered from her clothing was attributed to House through blood type analysis, the standard methodology before DNA testing was available to courts. Combined with the prior sex offense and his presence in the area, the evidence was enough. Paul House was convicted of first-degree murder. He was 27 years old when he entered death row. The sentence was death. The House case stands apart from others in this series for one specific reason. It went to the United States Supreme Court. The 9 justices who reviewed the full record, the DNA results, the vial analysis, the original testimony, concluded that the standard for habeas relief had been met. Their finding that no reasonable juror would have convicted on the complete evidence is a precise legal formulation with specific implications. It does not say Paul House was innocent. It says the evidence used to convict him was so compromised that it could not support the verdict. That distinction matters in the law. In the life of a man who spent 22 years on death row, it matters in a different register entirely. 2 findings, developed in the years that followed, dismantled the prosecution's physical case entirely. DNA testing established that the semen on Carolyn Muncie's clothing belonged to her husband, Hubert Muncie, not Paul House. The forensic examination of the blood on House's jeans produced an even more specific finding. The blood had originated from Carolyn Muncie's autopsy blood collection vials, which had cracked during transport inside the evidence container. Enzyme degradation analysis documented the biological distinction between blood stored in a sealed vessel and blood deposited on fabric during a living physical struggle. The markers were different. The FBI serologist had testified, under oath, that blood which had pooled from a broken laboratory vial onto a pair of jeans in a cardboard evidence box was the product of a violent murder. The Supreme Court's ruling in 2006 initiated a legal process that culminated in 2009 with the dismissal of all charges. Paul House had spent 22 years on death row. He was released in 2009. During those years of incarceration, he had developed multiple sclerosis, a disease that had progressed significantly by the time he was freed. He died in 2021 at 56 years old. He had been on death row since 1986. The disease that had developed during those years released him from everything else 12 years after that. The state of Tennessee had held Paul House for 22 years on blood from an evidence container and semen that belonged to another man. Case number 6, Greg Taylor. At a hearing of the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission, investigators produced a document that had been sitting in the State Bureau of Investigation's own records for 17 years. It was a laboratory notebook. It contained the results of a confirmatory chemical test that SBI Agent Duane Deaver had run on a substance recovered from the fender of Gregory Taylor's SUV. A test Deaver had never mentioned to investigators, never disclosed to the defense, and never referenced in his trial testimony. The result of that confirmatory test was negative. The substance on the fender of Gregory Taylor's vehicle was not human blood. Deaver had known this when he testified to the contrary. He had presented the result of a presumptive screening test, a preliminary analysis that reacts positively to dozens of substances other than human blood, as though it were definitive forensic proof, and he had buried the follow-up result that showed it was not. Deaver's name has appeared in this series before. He was the same SBI agent whose fabricated blood spatter testimony was central to the conviction of Michael Peterson. The pattern was not coincidence. It was method. Gregory Taylor was 31 years old in the fall of 1991. He lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. He had no documented connection to Jaquetta Thomas, no history with the location where her body was found, and no established motive of any kind. On the night of September 25th, 1991, his SUV became stuck in the mud near a cul-de-sac on the south side of Raleigh. That was the totality of his physical connection to the crime. A vehicle immobilized in the mud, in proximity to a place where something terrible had happened. The investigation that followed treated that proximity as a foundation and asked an SBI analyst to build something on it. Jaquetta Thomas was 30 years old. She had been struggling with drug addiction, and she was found beaten to death in that cul-de-sac on the night of September 25th, 1991. The circumstances of her life placed her in a dangerous area on a dangerous night. That fact does not diminish her. It does explain why the investigation that followed moved as quickly as it did toward the nearest available suspect, rather than toward a more thorough and less convenient truth. September 25th, 1991. Raleigh, North Carolina. Taylor's SUV was found stuck in the mud, not far from where Jaquetta Thomas's body had been discovered. Investigators observed a substance on the vehicle's front fender, collected it, and sent it to the SBI laboratory for analysis. Duane Deaver received the sample and began his examination. Deaver ran a presumptive chemical screening test, a standard preliminary tool in forensic biology, designed to indicate the possible presence of blood, not to confirm it. Presumptive tests produce positive results for numerous substances including plant peroxidases, rust, and various chemicals. They are understood in forensic practice to be starting points that require follow-up before any evidentiary claim can responsibly be made. The screening test on the substance from Taylor's fender returned a positive result. Standard protocol required a confirmatory test. Deaver ran one. The confirmatory result was negative. The substance was not human blood. Deaver recorded the negative result in his laboratory notebook, filed the notebook in SBI records, and testified at Gregory Taylor's 1993 trial that the substance on the fender was blood spatter from the violent bludgeoning of Jaquetta Thomas, placing Taylor's vehicle at the scene of her death with the authority of a certified state analyst. The conviction was entered in 1993. Life in prison. The laboratory notebook containing the negative confirmatory result sat in SBI files, untouched, for 17 years. The North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission represented a structural innovation in the state's criminal justice system. A formal body with the authority to investigate factual claims of innocence, independent of the standard appellate process. Its creation reflected an acknowledgement that the courts alone were insufficient to catch all wrongful convictions, particularly those where the exculpatory evidence had never been introduced at trial because it had been buried in a filing cabinet. The Taylor case was its first success. The notebook Deaver had kept and concealed was the kind of evidence that standard appellate review, focused on legal errors rather than factual ones, might never have surfaced. The commission found it. Whether it would have been found without the commission is a question the filing cabinet could not answer. The North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission was established in 2006 as a formal mechanism for reviewing claims of factual innocence in the state. When it took Gregory Taylor's case, investigators located Deaver's laboratory files, the notebook, the negative confirmatory test. The gap between what had been recorded and what had been testified to was documented and undeniable. The commission established that the substance on Taylor's SUV had never been confirmed as human blood, that the testimony used to convict him had been built on a result Deaver had known was inconclusive, while concealing the test result that said so definitively. Gregory Taylor's conviction was vacated in February 2010. He became the first person freed by the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. He had served 17 years. The SBI audit, triggered by Deaver's exposure across the Taylor and Peterson cases, reviewed every conviction he had touched. Gregory Taylor is 66 years old. He is free. In the years following his exoneration, the SBI audit, triggered by Deaver's exposure across the Taylor and Peterson cases, reviewed every conviction his laboratory work had touched. A review that identified other cases where his methodology was questionable and his findings were unsupported by the underlying analysis. The notebook sat in an SBI filing cabinet for 17 years. The commission found it. The question of how many other notebooks remain unfound is one the audit was designed, imperfectly, to answer. Case number 7. William Richards. William Richards spent 23 years in a California state prison before anyone tested the cinder block. The cinder block had been identified as the murder weapon in the death of Pamela Richards. Lifted, the prosecution argued, across 3 separate trials spanning nearly a decade, by William Richards, and brought down on his wife's head at their remote property in the Mojave Desert. When the weapon was finally subjected to DNA analysis, the biological material recovered from it belonged to an unknown male. Not William Richards. He had been in state prison for more than a decade by the time anyone thought to test the actual weapon. That result, and the 23 years he ultimately served, prompted the California legislature to pass a law specifically designed to ensure it could not happen again. William Richards was 43 years old in August 1993. He was an engineer by profession, methodical and technical in his work. He and his wife, Pamela, owned a piece of remote land in the Mojave Desert, a spare private property used for camping, the kind of place that couples sometimes hold on to for its quiet distance from the pressures of ordinary life. On August 10, 1993, Pamela Richards was found dead at that property. She had been strangled and bludgeoned. William had found her body. Before law enforcement arrived at that remote location, he had touched her, handled her remains in the way that a person does when they have just found someone they loved dead and cannot process what they are seeing. That contact, that entirely human response to a terrible discovery, became the prosecution's forensic cornerstone. Pamela Richards was 43 years old. She was William's wife, and she had gone to their Mojave Desert property on that August day. She was found there, dead, strangled, and bludgeoned with a cinder block left at the scene. Her death was not in dispute. What 3 separate juries were asked to determine was who had committed it. The DNA on the murder weapon, tested years too late, answered that question. The answer was not William Richards. August 10th, 1993. The Mojave Desert, California. Responding investigators observed a microscopic speck of blood on the sole of William Richards' shoe. The cinder block was identified as the probable murder weapon and taken into evidence. A blood spatter analyst was retained to examine the speck. A forensic odontologist separately offered bite mark evidence, a field that has faced profound credibility challenges in subsequent years, and whose findings in multiple cases have since been discredited or abandoned. The cinder block sat in evidence storage. No one applied DNA testing to the murder weapon in 1993. The blood spatter analyst concluded that the single microscopic speck on Richards' shoe was high-velocity impact spatter, the fine droplet pattern produced when a heavy object strikes a surface with force. The analyst's testimony was that this speck proved Richards had delivered the fatal blow. The defense's position that the speck was transfer blood, deposited when Richards found and physically touched Pamela's body at the scene, was not the conclusion the prosecution's expert offered. The state brought the case to trial in 1995. The jury deadlocked. A second trial in 1996 produced a second hung jury. The state prosecuted a third time in 1997. At the third trial in 1997, the evidence was the same: the speck and the bite mark. 2 separate juries had reviewed this evidence and found it insufficient to convict. The third convicted William Richards of first-degree murder. The sentence was 25 years to life. The 3-trial history of the Richards case is worth sitting with. 2 separate juries, drawn from the same county in the same decade, reviewed the blood spatter testimony and the bite mark evidence and found them insufficient to convict. They could not reach a unanimous verdict. The state's response to those 2 hung juries was not to reconsider whether its evidence was adequate. It was to try a third time. California law permitted it. The third jury convicted. Whether the difference between the third jury and the first 2 was the evidence, the presentation, or chance is not a question the record can answer. What the record shows is that 3 prosecutions, 2 hung juries, and a conviction built on a microscopic speck all preceded a DNA result that should have been sought in 1993. When DNA analysis was finally applied to the cinder block, the biological profile developed from the weapon matched an unknown male, not William Richards. Blood spatter analysis conducted in review concluded that the speck on his shoe was transfer blood consistent with direct contact with Pamela's body. Both elements of the prosecution's physical evidence were invalidated. Richards was exonerated and released in 2016, at age 74. He had served 23 years. California Senate Bill 1058 established a formal mechanism allowing convictions to be challenged when forensic experts retract discredited testimony or when accepted scientific methodologies are found to be invalid. The law bore no individual's name. It existed because of what happened to William Richards across 3 trials, 1 microscopic speck, and 23 years in a California prison. The cinder block held the answer from the day it was collected. The biological material on the murder weapon was there in 1993, 1995, and 1997, through 3 trials in which it was never tested. The decision not to apply available DNA analysis to the actual weapon in those proceedings is not explained in the public record. It was tested eventually. The profile it produced did not match the man who had spent 23 years in California State Prison. William Richards is 74 years old. He is free. California Senate Bill 1058 exists for the people who came after him, the law now provides a mechanism it did not provide for him. Case number 8, Russ Faria. The prosecution's blood spatter expert told the jury in Troy, Missouri, that the evidence at the Faria home was staged. The blood on the light switch, staged. The blood found on Russell Faria's slippers near the entryway, staged. And the alibi, the prosecution argued, was the most suspicious element of all. Multiple witnesses at a friend's game night in Lake St. Louis. Time-stamped gas station receipts documenting Russ Faria's route, both to and from the gathering. A fully corroborated evening that placed him miles from his home at every relevant hour. The prosecution's position was that this documentation was too thorough, too carefully assembled, that a man who had genuinely been elsewhere would not have coverage this complete or witnesses this numerous. The blood spatter expert's analysis of the scene was offered as forensic confirmation. Russ Faria had killed his wife, arranged the physical evidence to support a false alibi, and relied on the staging to complete his cover. His documented innocence was the evidence of his guilt. Russell Faria lived in Troy, Missouri. On the evening of December 27, 2011, he was at a friend's house for a game night. He had left his home that afternoon. His route was captured on surveillance cameras at a gas station where he stopped for fuel. The people at the game night were multiple, independent witnesses who had no particular stake in his situation. He arrived. He was present throughout the evening. He left. His return trip passed the same gas station. When he came home to the house in Troy, he found his wife, Betsy, dead in the living room. He called 911. Betsy Faria was 42 years old. She had been living with a terminal cancer diagnosis and was managing the advanced stages of her illness at home, continuing her daily life as long as she was able. In the weeks before her death, Betsy had changed the beneficiary designation on a $150,000 life insurance policy, signing it over to her friend Pam Hupp. Russ Faria was not the beneficiary. On December 27, 2011, Betsy was found stabbed 55 times. The investigation focused on her husband. The prosecution's blood spatter analyst examined the scene and concluded that the physical evidence was inconsistent with an intruder and consistent with staging by someone who had committed the murder and then deliberately arranged the environment afterward. The blood on the light switch and the blood on Russ's slippers were presented as supporting details of this staged scenario. The comprehensive alibi documentation, the receipts, the cameras, the witnesses, was absorbed into the prosecution's theory rather than allowed to undermine it. The argument was explicit. Russ had constructed the alibi deliberately as the foundation of a false narrative. The more thoroughly his innocence was documented, the prosecution argued, the more it proved his guilt. In 2013, the jury heard both the alibi evidence and the blood spatter testimony. They convicted Russell Faria of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. He was convicted of killing a woman who had been killed by someone else. The blood spatter expert who testified against Russ Faria was not arguing that a specific pattern proved he was present. He was arguing that the overall configuration of the scene, the specific blood locations, combined with the documentary evidence of Russ's absence, proved that the scene had been arranged. It was a theory that required the forensic evidence to do something unusual, to serve not as proof of the defendant's presence, but as proof that his absence was fabricated. Blood spatter was deployed not to trace a killer to a scene, but to disqualify an alibi. The logical structure of that argument, presented to a Missouri jury in 2013, was enough to send an innocent man to prison. It took a bench trial in 2015 and a judge willing to evaluate the full record before the argument collapsed. Pam Hupp had become Betsy's life insurance beneficiary 6 weeks before the murder. The $150,000 that passed to her upon Betsy's death was a motive the prosecution never considered when building its case against Russ. As subsequent investigation developed, Hupp's financial connection to the timing of Betsy's death became the subject of focused scrutiny. In 2021, Pam Hupp was convicted of a separate, unrelated murder committed in Missouri and was implicated, though not criminally convicted, in Betsy Faria's death. The evidence of her possible involvement in Betsy's killing, including the insurance policy timeline and her documented conduct around the time of the murder, was placed before the court at Russ Faria's retrial. A bench retrial was held in 2015. A judge reviewed the complete record, the alibi, the insurance policy signed over 6 weeks before Betsy died, the inadequacy of the staged spatter theory, and the name on the life insurance document that the original prosecution had never examined. When the Pam Hupp evidence was placed before the court alongside the alibi documentation, the theory that had convinced a jury in 2013 did not survive the scrutiny of a single judge in 2015. The judge found Russell Faria not guilty. He had spent 2 years in prison for a murder. A blood spatter expert said he staged, and the record showed he did not commit. The state of Missouri settled with him for $2 million. The case became the subject of the NBC podcast The Thing About Pam and a subsequent television series. Russell Faria is free. The $2 million settlement is the state's acknowledgement, in the only language available to it, of what those 2 years cost.